All right, welcome everyone. Yes, Lori, you have a question to start? Right. So I'll repeat them. So I'll be the sort of both ways translator for those who are online. You ask a question, and I'll let the group know what it is and then answer. And likewise, when the group asks a question, I'll repeat it so the people online can hear what's happening. Okay, more people coming in. That's great. Um, Good. Lise, can you call Marlene Brand and see what was going on? For some reason, she called me, but she couldn't. I think maybe she can't get in. Do you have her number?
No.
Okay, there you go. Okay, so this is our first meeting of our Crucifixion of the King of Glory group, and I'm really looking forward to this. I I listened to the book uh, maybe a month or two ago, and I knew the author, Presbyteria Eugenia.
Does she need a code?
To get in, no?
No, he says no.
Is she having trouble with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Marlene, I'll try to send you directly from my phone the link.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking for
Okay.
now. We can
So,
figure it out later.
yep, I'll do that right now. I'll send
Okay.
you a link. Okay, it should
All
work,
right.
hypothetically.
Okay.
All right, this is just the first class, and that's just what it's going to be. It's going to be some technical issues until we get this thing figured out. Wait 1 second. Like that. And I want to share that. Why are you fighting me? Stop.
I opened the book and the first name I saw was Julius Epiphanes.
Yeah,
Never knew Julius Epiphanes.
yeah, one of the emperors. Uh-huh.
Right there. Right, and then below that was Adrian, I think, a couple paragraphs.
Yeah,
I saw something else.
one really interesting thing I think about this book is that it really it forces us, if we're going to get anything out of it, to leave the paradigm of a modern Western person, because that's not the way. That was not the way that Christ lived. He didn't live in a modern Western person's society. He lived in a completely different society. And like I said, that's one of the things I really liked about it, is that it forced me to sort of leave a little bit that mindset. So, okay, so here is our book, and I listened to the book, and I thought it was so good that we should read it together. It'll be a great way for us to prepare for Holy Week. I know that's a long way away, but nonetheless, the thing about Holy Week is it's so compact and it's so fast. We just fly through the week, and if we don't have something like this to ground us, it's very easy to just miss it in the blink of an eye. So I think that by reading the book, we're going to really help each other to become much more familiar with what's happening during Holy Week, because we will understand why it's happening. We'll understand the context of what's happening. It's not just something that happened to Christ. This was not just like. Everything is contextual, and when you understand the context, it's so much easier. So I realize that not everybody read the book. Has the book yet. So please get that if you can. I texted Svetlana, who's the head of our kiosk, to ask her when she thinks those books will come in. But you can get it at Amazon or get it wherever you want. Ancient Faith. It's published by Ancient Faith, which is an excellent publishing house, and they have great books there. We've read some great books with the teenagers from there, and a lot of the books we have in the kiosk are from there. They just really do a great job. So you could buy it from them too, whatever works. I noticed that they have an ebook option on Ancient Faith that I didn't see on Amazon. But if you're an Audible person, you can also listen. So whatever works for you. So there's lots of options, but you'll want to try to pick up the book in the next few days, probably, because we'll read through chapter 1 next time. These introductory texts are good and important, and I think that we should read through them if you hadn't had a chance to do that, if you haven't had the book in your hands. But it's not crucial that you do that just now. Yeah, go ahead.
It's also on this site that I love, AB Books.
ABE. ABE,
ABE, like Abe Lincoln.
Yeah.
And they have used stock, and they're mostly like either free shipping or $3.99.
Paula's pointing out for those who are online that it's also available on Books, ABE. I actually have to buy a lot of books there too because I usually am looking for something obscure that's out of print. Okay, so does anyone have logistical questions about how we will meet, where you can get the book, having any troubles? I thought we should try to answer a few of those first, and then we can go right into the content of the introduction and the little piece right after the introduction that the author writes. So any questions about any of those things?
Any tests or exams will have?
No tests or exams, no. Unfortunately, no. My wife wanted that, but I said, no, we're going to be merciful. Okay, so as I was reading, understanding that folks might not get the book in time to read everything, I was making note of things that I thought that should be read out to you and give people a chance to discuss those. So that's not the way this is going to be all the time. I hope it's going to be much more interactive, but at least we'll start that way and see how that goes for today. Okay, so first is the introduction. So something I thought very interesting that she wrote: we cannot fully appreciate the power and meaning of the Lord's passion without a greater appreciation of his time and culture. He was the pure and spotless Lamb of God, not only blameless of any crime, but innocent of any sin at all. Why would anyone seek to destroy love and mercy incarnate? He performed countless miracles and taught with incomparable eloquence and wisdom. He was patient, forgiving, gentle, and loving. Why didn't all Jews accept him as the Messiah? Why were the Jewish leaders determined to kill him? And then she says, let us enter into Christ's world that we might learn how and why the events of Holy Week unfolded as they did, what he endured for our salvation, and the depth of his love expressed ultimately in his voluntary crucifixion for our sakes. So this essentially is what the book is about, an explanation on a really detailed level, but not detailed like things can be detailed and boring. I think this is detailed and interesting, mostly because, as I was speaking about before we started recording, you really have to leave a little bit your paradigm of the modern Western person to understand what life was like in the Roman Empire and what it was like. And we're not even talking about Rome here now, we're talking about a province of the Roman Empire. So if we don't understand, for instance, that the Romans considered captive peoples to be slaves, well, then it doesn't make a lot of sense, some of the things that are done or said, or how Christ interacts with them and they interact with him. So understanding that context gives so much more meaning to what happens, rather than, it sometimes feels like crucifixion was something that happened to Christ. If we understand the context, we understand that it was completely voluntary and that he did this strictly for our salvation. Now, we say those words and we hear those words. What I'm hoping is that by the time we finish the book, we'll understand those words. Not just as something that we say, but as something that we know very viscerally, I would say. So, something to know about Presbyteria Eugenia. I think she has 6 advanced degrees, you know, like, okay, whatever. Most in theology, 1 in law. She's a very down-to-earth person despite that. I mean, she even signed my book for me. See. We had her talk at our clergy and laity conference. Marlene, when was that? 3 years ago or 2?
No, it was no more than 2. It just
Okay,
feels like
I
a
think-
year ago in Texas.
Yeah, it was very nice. She was. It was 2 or 3 years ago, and we meet every 3 years in the diocese with the clergy and representatives from all the parishes, laity from all the parishes, and she was our guest speaker, and it was really wonderful to hear her speak. So,
It was.
she has a super podcast, or at least she did. I don't know if she's still doing it, if she has enough time to do that. But she's on YouTube. She's on wherever if people like to listen to podcasts, that's how I usually do it. But whatever. Yeah, her podcast is amazing. So she doesn't doesn't have like these airs of an academic kind of talking down to you, which is what I really like about her. And she doesn't write like that either. Like, I'm smarter than you. And it always turns me off when someone who knows a lot kind of shows that off. And I don't think she does that. She didn't do that in our conference, and I don't think that she does it in her books. The other, I think, relatively famous book that she has is called Thinking Orthodox. And if this particular reading group goes well and there's a few casualties, we'll probably do that one next, and maybe just rotate kind of between the two. But I would say Thinking Orthodox is one of the most important texts available for those who are becoming Orthodox or have been Orthodox for a while, even maybe even more important to those folks, because it helps to understand why sometimes we become Orthodox and then we feel like we're hitting this wall. By understanding the sort of thought process of Eastern people, it can make it a lot easier for us to also live as Orthodox Christians. So anyway, that's a great book, and it's also available on Audible if you like to listen to things. So in the beginning, in the introduction, she sort of goes through a lot of a critique, I would say, of modern biblical scholarship, which is, in my opinion, she's much too soft. Modern biblical scholarship it's a train wreck. It's just terrible. In the Western world, the vast majority of biblical scholars don't either have faith or don't take their faith into account when they are doing their work as biblical scholars. And so it becomes a very rationalistic and cold approach to the scripture with a lot of skepticism. I mean, just ridiculous skepticism. And she goes through a little bit here in the introduction about how historians think that the Bible is just marvelous, but biblical scholars think that it's not. So this book extends far beyond a simple presentation of the Bible and church tradition. My comments are grounded in research on ancient society, attitudes, customs, practices, medicine, botany, law, and the history of first century Jewish, Roman, and Christian cultures, as well as Orthodox tradition and the writings of the fathers of the church, which are important witness to the early understanding of the Gospels. Unfortunately, many scholars take precisely this position, take the position in biblical studies that they ignore the facts and evidence and make statements based on their personal assumptions or religious beliefs. But the Gospels are historical accounts and deserve to be taken seriously as historical documents. And she talks quite a bit about that, why first generation witness accounts are considered to be so authentic by historians. I think this is useful for all of us, even if you never come to another class here, to understand that the Gospels are highly prized by historians, even if modern biblical scholars have all kinds of bad things to say about it. Historians really think that they're great. So historians consider the Gospels to be early and extremely credible documents because they were written within the lifetime of people who witnessed the events. This means that many eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ were still alive when the Gospels were written, probably between the years 70 and 90 AD. Of course, as I think most people know, the teaching of the church and the preaching of the gospel was all oral until it was written down, as they realized, okay, these people are going to die. We need to write these things down, and we need to be able to share these things. And the concept of scripture was a little bit broader in the second and third generation after Christ also, because it's not like they were printing these things on printing presses or like sending them over the internet. Believe it or not, they didn't have that. No iPhones either, and they still survived. So not every local church had all of the books of the Bible. That probably was true until after Constantine, most likely, even after that. And so in addition to like the epistles of Paul or Peter or James, the epistles of Clement, of Polycarp, those were often read in the church as well. The Old Testament was read. They had that, and when Christ is talking about the scriptures, that's what he's talking about, is the Old Testament, right? When he says search the scriptures or whatever, he's not talking about search the scriptures that are going to be written in 100 years. He's talking about search now, what you have. So it's important for us to understand those things. yeah, I think those are important things for us to understand. Now, this next part I think is extraordinarily important. Wouldn't early believers quickly embellish the story of Jesus with legendary or mythological elements? So wouldn't they add to it to try to make it more amazing? Actually, no. The usual pattern for first generation witness accounts is quite the opposite. Historians prefer earlier accounts because first generation witnesses are very reliable and less likely to include embellishments than the writers of later accounts. That I think is really, really interesting. Classical historians are puzzled by the unwarranted skepticism of many biblical scholars towards the Gospels, since they are first generation historical sources about Jesus. Historians are much more objective and unbiased toward the use of New Testament books as historical sources and apply the same standard and analysis they would for any other written source. So I think that's important, not just for the book that we're going to read, but just for our general understanding as Christians, that even if modern biblical scholars tend to be extraordinarily skeptical about the Bible, which seems completely contrary, but in any case, that is the truth. That is the way that they look at those things. But historians look at it as something that's a great account and completely legitimate. It's also confirmed in other places by other sources. And there's a lot of historical content in the Gospels that can be checked by checking other accounts of the same time, and they always align. So this, I think, is really good for us because we very easily buy into this skeptical approach that Western people have, that, you know, if this isn't confirmed by 27 witnesses, you know, that there's no way that anything could possibly be true. Well, actually, the Gospels are confirmed by many, many more witnesses than that. But I think this little piece is important for us, just as because temptations will come to us about, oh, didn't somebody make this stuff up? Actually, this is considered to be like A1 historical information, and historians love the gospel because of that. So any questions or thoughts about that? I highly recommend that you don't read very much modern biblical scholarship. I had to do that for an academic process that I was in. It was extraordinarily painful and just really not at all pleasant and not supportive of faith. I mean, usually when I say don't read something, then everybody runs out to read it, and that's fine. But I'm just telling you, it's not very helpful or useful, I don't think. Yes, Lori.
Are you talking about early Orthodox?
I'm talking about modern biblical scholarship, like from the, let's say, from the 60s on.
I don't know if you know Dr. Boccaccini, Gabriele.
Mm-mm.
He was, I mean, he is still alive. He taught a second, he's Jewish.
Uh-huh.
And so he taught at the University of Michigan, like the second, I can't remember the name of it. But here at some point, I wanted to participate to some lectures that he had about Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, no, and then Daniela said, he does not have our perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I get it, but that's when I learned that probably I should not listen to Jew talking about Paul, even though
Paul was a Jew, of course. So Paula was just making a comment about one of the biblical scholars at University of Michigan. That she was. Did you sit in his class?
he's one of my friends, one of my dads.
Okay.
He's from Middle.
Yeah. Very good.
No, I didn't sit.
So, I would like to read something else then, if nobody has other comments about that. This is another, I think, interesting quote from the introduction. Living eyewitnesses ensure greater accuracy for another reason. The evangelists cared about their personal reputations, just as we would. Not only would it have been dishonest deliberately to invent stories or details about Jesus, but falsehoods would have been refuted by eyewitnesses, destroying the credibility of the author. That's an interesting, I never thought about it that way until I read that. It makes perfect sense, right? If you just start making stuff up, people are like, we were there. You know, we were there. You can't do this. So the church leaders after the apostles did not decide for themselves what to believe or how to behave as Christians. Early Christians learned everything from the apostles, who had learned directly from the Lord himself. The Gospels were written later as a supplement to the primarily oral preaching of the gospel message. The first Christians did not learn about Jesus by reading the Gospels. Understanding this requires a paradigm shift in our thinking. And that's because we live in essentially a Protestant society, right? I mean, certainly it's a Protestant society which is becoming a secular society. And I just read a really interesting book called Pagan America, which argues that actually there's no such thing as a clean, purely secular society. Your choice is Christianity or paganism. There's not some middle ground there. And I thought that was a very interesting book, very interesting points that the author made. And we can talk about that more if you want to, but in any case, I think that's a really interesting point. The skepticism in our culture subjects everything in the Bible to a test of rationalism and leaves no room for the miraculous. But God is not limited by the laws of nature, and he operates outside the realm of human reason. This is the very message of the cross. So, thoughts about any of these things? Yes, Lori.
It's not difficult about talking to people about Christ. This rationalism.
So Lori is saying that one of the things that she finds so difficult in talking to people about Christ is this sort of cold rationalism that pervades our society.
People try to understand Christ as a human being.
Right.
instead of-
People try to understand Christ only as a human being. Of course, as Orthodox Christians, we understand that God, he can be outside of, he created physics and mathematics and everything else, so he can be 200%. He's completely God and completely man. We only have 100%, but he has 200%. And if that's a very important tenet of the faith, that Jesus Christ is completely God and completely man. But people, I think in our days, it's very difficult for them to understand something like that.
human reasoning.
Right. And some of that, and if you read her other book, she goes into really a really good explanation of the way that theology is done in the West, which is with a lot of philosophy and rationalism, and not the way that Orthodox Christians do it, is by simply essentially explaining the revelation of God, not the book of the Bible. I mean, God's revelation to man. So it's a completely different way that we think, but the way that that theology is done in the West, of course, eventually trickled down into the entire educational system, and we don't even know that we are educated in that way, to only look at things rationally, not in any other fashion. I mean, secular education, okay, but if we don't understand that that's the way we see the whole world, that also, of course, bleeds into our religious lives, and we have to understand that that's not the way that the church has ever understood Christ, that they are the way that the church has ever understood theology at all. So I know it sounds on one hand like kind of crazy, like how can I think differently? How can I have a different perspective? This book will help. And it's not that we're supposed to suspend reality. That's not it at all. But to understand that the church doesn't necessarily see things the same way that our modern secular society does shouldn't be a shock to anyone. And that's usually one of the reasons why people are here, because they would like to have a perspective which is not the same as the modern secular society. But as we enter into this book, we're going to have to enter into that a little bit. We're going to have to kind of say, okay, I need to be able to see this like a Roman. I need to be able to see this like a first century Jew. And I think she does a good job of helping us to do that. Yeah. So interesting. The Orthodox Church does not oppose serious biblical scholarship. The fathers of the church were not fundamentalists. They actually applied most of the techniques used in modern biblical scholarship. They lived in an era closer to the events of the New Testament and were in a much better position than we are to interpret and explain what truly happened. The fathers of the church applied not only their minds and education to understand the biblical text, but also their lives of holiness and prayer. And this is a key differentiating factor between the East and the West. They had spiritual insight, which is not acquired through books instruction, but through a religious life. Even intelligent and sincere scholars who reject a faith perspective and are not engaged in spiritual struggle can never correctly understand or explain the Bible. So St. John Chrysostom, we all know his name because he wrote down the liturgy that we often use. And he gave, I think, a real good way for us to see this. St. John Chrysostom often spoke of the need for real study and expertise to understand the scriptures. He compared these skills to mining for gold, which requires hard work, the right tools, and specialized knowledge in order to acquire the treasure. Much of what is valuable in the Bible is not found on the surface. Chrysostom said, just as gold is not easily acquired by simply scratching the surface of the ground. He also reminds us that academic study is only part of what is necessary for understanding the scriptures. It also requires silence, faith, a life of prayer, and especially virtue. The Bible is spiritual and can be correctly understood only by those who are spiritual. Saint Evagrius, one of the Egyptian fathers of the 4th century, said, a true theologian is one who truly prays, and one who truly prays is a true theologian. That, I think, is a really interesting and pretty concise understanding about how the church sees our lives, that study and prayer are not two different things. One enhances the other. So if we want to understand the scriptures, we need to live an Orthodox life. I think that's pretty interesting. It's not just a question of reading enough books about the scriptures. It's a question of also living a life that is in conformance with the scriptures. She goes through a little bit and talks about the modern media representation or entertainment presentation of the Gospels, and she critiques those. I think it's interesting. It's definitely worth reading because those things do affect us. But she essentially says that that's not going to be helpful for us. In fact, it'll probably be detrimental for us if we spend a lot of time watching, Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. I mean, has its interest, but is not really what we would consider to be a legitimate expression of what really happened. Yes.
It's actually it's disgusting,
You mean gory, kind of?
very gory.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that she didn't mention the Jesus of the Hirelli. And Jesus of Nazareth came out probably 1979 or 1980. And in Italy, they kept playing
Mhm.
like in 3 episodes every Easter
Oh.
for years.
Mhm.
But it was beautiful. I mean, it was brutal, somewhat gory, but not to the level of this one. I wasn't expecting. I mean, I I just couldn't do it.
So Paula is talking about a depiction of Christ's life in Crucifixion that came out in Italy in around 1980.
1979, 80.
And she thought that was a much better than the Passion. Is it Passion of the Christ? What is that thing called? Yeah.
Yeah, the Passion of
Yeah.
Christ.
So anyway, I think something very, very interesting. What's the popular one that Natasha likes?
The Chosen.
Yeah. Also,
Chosen is
rather theologically challenged. Yes, Chris.
So what did you say about the theologian? The one who prays does what?
So a true theologian is one who prays truly, and one who prays truly is a true theologian.
Right. So about the praying. So were they prostrating in that time?
In Christ's time?
Yeah, because the prostrating, like putting your head on the floor,
Mhm.
like that physical variable is been one of the most beneficial things that I've learned here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like really, really special is the prostration because it helps your body a lot.
Hmm.
It really helped a lot of my issues. Were they praying like that at that time?
So Chris is asking the question about physically prostrating oneself to the ground, and he's saying that that's one of the things that has helped him most by coming to St. Vladimir's. So the answer is yes. There's only two postures before God. There's standing or prostrating. Sitting, like think about King Arthur's court, if you can. The king is sitting because he's the one who's in charge. Others are before him standing, or they might even be kneeling if they're in trouble, right? But they're not sitting. Sitting is the purview of the person who is the leader, who's in charge. And it's interesting in the St. James liturgy, which is the most ancient liturgy that we have in the church that was written down. It says that the bishop gives his sermon sitting. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't stand. He sits down on a throne that is brought to a big chair that's brought to the ambo, and he sits and gives the sermon. So yes, the answer is yes. There was no known posture of sitting at worship, and so the Jews, just like the Christians, prostrated or stood.
I like that.
I mean, a lot of honestly, and you'll read in the book, and she sort of lays out how, of course, the first Christians were Jews, right? And they didn't kick them immediately out from the synagogues. They did eventually, and then things. I mean, this was God's providence, obviously, but the architecture of the church, a lot of our worship comes right from the temple practices. And that's normal. I mean, Christ came as a Jew, right? And so his first disciples were essentially all Jews. And of course, there were a few Gentiles mixed in there, and it's clear that Christ came principally for the Jews, but he also showed, even in his lifetime, that he was going to be for the Gentiles as well. And then in Acts of the Apostles, there's the famous vision that Peter has that essentially leads the apostles to understand that Christianity, this way, what they called the way at that point, that's not from the Mandalorian, by the way. That's from ancient Christianity, the way, that this would be not just for Jews, that this would also be for Gentiles, which is just a nice way of saying pagans, because everyone else in the world at that time worshipped idols, right? It was our ancestors were worshiping idols as well as everyone else except for the Jews. There was just that small remnant, but of course then it began to spread. Chris, you had a question?
I just want to follow up. And like the standing aspect is like so special too, because people here are so strong, like physically strong. And like to stand for hours and then to bend and then squat and then like something like there's like, I mean, God is strength, and the people here are very like physically fit. Like Constantine is very, very probably the strongest fit man I've ever been around.
So I'm just going to let everybody know Christopher is also talking about how helpful it is to worship standing, because of course on Sundays, because on Sunday we're stressing our sonship, our adoption by God, and the son doesn't prostrate before his father, right? So we stand on Sundays. It's also the day of the resurrection, which is all about up and not about down. But on the other days, so the other 6 days of the week, there's prostrations done in the church. We just don't usually come to church on those days because we're in the world, we're doing what we need to do, we have to support our families, it's all good. But the rare day is the day that you only stand in church. Most of the time, 80-something% of the time, let's say, we actually do prostrations in the church. So I think that's an interesting little data point that most folks don't feel, because mostly we come on Saturday night and Sunday. Yeah, I'm trying not to get too much into the weeds, but okay. Let's see. Oh, so at the end of the introduction, she talks a little bit about, let us journey to Jerusalem. So she's talking about Holy Week. And this is the whole point of working on this book, is that we prepare ourselves well for Holy Week. So The week begins, she writes, the day before Palm Sunday, on what the Orthodox Church calls the Saturday of Lazarus, and continues through Pascha and the appearance of the Lord to his disciples on the evening of the resurrection day. So, we believe that the week begins on Monday, because that's the way our work week is. The first day of the week actually is Sunday. And that's because for the Jews, the day of rest was Saturday. That was the day that the Lord rested. Okay, so this is how we get to this point. Saturday was the last day of the week. Sunday is the first day of the week, the day of the resurrection, but we go to work on Monday. So we had this feeling like the week begins on Monday. So as long as we understand all of those presuppositions, then it's not too hard for us to understand that Holy Week doesn't necessarily begin on a Monday. So the last day of Great Lent is the Friday before Lazarus Saturday. And that's the time when those monastics who had been wandering in the desert for 40 days arrived back at the monasteries, those who survived. And we read about that in the life of St. Mary of Egypt. So if that sounds like a weird supposition that I'm saying there, have a look at that. They go through quite, not in too much detail, but explain that the monastics wandered in the deserts. That's how Zosimus found her, because he went out to wander in the desert and he found her. So Lazarus Saturday, that's the first day of Holy Week. Now that has an interesting, a very interesting little aspect to it. So either who's online or who's sitting here, what do you think is like the ultimate culinary expression of Pascha? Like, what's the most classic food that's eaten on the day of the resurrection?
Lamb.
At least in
Lots of lamb being, Euphemia says lamb too.
How about an egg?
Yeah.
Our head reader says, how about an egg? And that's what I was fishing for, was egg. So chicken egg, right? So on Lazarus Saturday, which is a foreshadowing of the resurrection, it's the only day of the year that it says in the Typicon, which is the church's kind of like explanation book, that you can have fish eggs. So it's like the symbol of it's a foreshadowing of the resurrection. And because of that, then caviar is allowed on that day. It's egg. It's an egg, but it's a fasting egg. So isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Like it sort of reminds us that this, in just a week, we will be at the resurrection and we'll be, eating those chicken eggs, which we haven't eaten for 40 something days. But on this day, as a reminder of the impending resurrection, we are allowed to eat caviar. So
Is there a preference of that or red?
no preference. It's definitely a personal preference. Although we often will, we in the past, the clergy have kind of run out and got some on Friday night after the service begins for Lazarus Saturday, and gotten some red eggs. So we're ready to go for the next day. So that's, I think, it's just an interesting little piece. So she says, every detail found in the Gospels is echoed and interpreted in the eloquent hymns and prayers, which meditate on and then express the meaning of the historical events. Orthodox Christianity has preserved practices, prayers, divine services, and traditions stretching back to the early church. The Orthodox services of Holy Week express how the early church understood the events of Christ's passion through countless subtle details. The impact and value of holy tradition is never so obvious in Orthodoxy as it is during Holy Week, as we hear the ancient voices of our ancestors in the faith whispering in our ears. I think there's really something to that. Holy Week is very intense. It's one of those weeks of the year when we have services every morning and every evening. But every service has its meaning, and especially the first half of the week, which most of the time we're kind of like, everything begins on Thursday night. Well, actually, that's not really true. Everything begins on Lazarus Saturday. And that prepares us for Palm Sunday, when Christ is welcomed into Jerusalem as King and God. And that already we hear during the Palm Sunday reading of the gospel, not everybody's so excited about this God. And so everything kind of goes step by step, day by day, and brings us to that beautiful service on Thursday night, where we are mystically present with the Lord at his crucifixion and his death and his burial. When we attend the divine services, we are mystically present at the events that happen there and that are commemorated there. And so not everybody can come to every service, and that's okay. But we have to also understand that there's some special blessing about being in the church for a service, and especially these Holy Week services. Like, we want to be with Christ during this time, when he's with his disciples, when he communes them for the first time. That's Thursday morning, when he's betrayed, and so on and so forth. It's not just, you could read the services at home, but there's a special grace. The church has always taught that we are, in a way, present at the events that are being commemorated. And so it's good for us to sort of try to set aside as much time as we can during Holy Week to be there, because it only comes once a year, and we're never 100% sure that we're going to make it to the next one. Okay, that's an important piece, I think. And then she goes, she does a little aside, which I thought was good, about the Jewish people, the death of Jesus Christ, and how Christianity has understood that throughout time. So this all is very well worth reading. I don't think I have to encourage you too much, but I thought that was good. We're all creatures of our time when we live. And it's true that sometimes during Holy Week, in the ancient Orthodox countries, there were like anti-Semitic things that happened. That was not something that was blessed by the church, and I'll give you a good example of that right now. Metropolitan Anthony Krapivitsky was the Metropolitan of Kiev, so one of the only 3 metropolitans in the pre-revolutionary Russian Church, and one of only 4 people to get votes when they reestablished the Patriarchate. So this was an important bishop. And so on Holy Thursday evening, he was returning home from the services, and there was some mob that was going to do some bad thing to synagogue or something like that. Anyway, he figured that out, and he put his carriage between himself and those people, between the synagogue or whatever, and those people, and stopped them from going to do that. And I think that's, it's nice to read hypothetical accounts of this or that, and I'm not saying that what she wrote here is not good, but to see how it's put into action in life, I think that's important for us. We don't need just theories. We do need theories, but we need practice. We need to see how those theories are put into practice in real life. And that, to me, I think is a very stark kind of example of how this is someone who is completely imbued with the church life. He knew the Gospels by heart. He lived a purely church life. He came from a aristocratic family in St. Petersburg, and he drove his parents crazy because he hated to go to the opera, and he hated all of those trappings of aristocracy, and he would do everything that he could to get out of that, because just all he wanted to do was go to the monastery and follow Christ. So this is one of the most educated people before the revolution in Russia, and I think he showed very well exactly how the church sees these things. So she points out that it's ridiculous to blame all Jews for Christ's crucifixion, and it's also ridiculous to say that there were no Jews that had anything to do with it. I mean, obviously the leaders of the Jewish people were pretty excited to get rid of Christ. So to say that that's not true is just silly. But to say also that like all of the people are, should be blamed for this is also silly. So in Orthodox Christianity, we try to avoid the extremes and live in the middle. And I think she does a good job of explaining that in this little piece, which is just like 2-3 pages long, but I think very good. And then I wanted to read you this because I don't know how her fellow Greeks feel about this. The ancient Greeks gave us many wonderful things: science, mathematics, literature, history, art, theater, philosophy. But they did not give us the gospel or the truth about the one true God. Above all, they did not give us the Christ. And what she's pointing out is that Jesus Christ was a Jew and he lived as a Jew. He lived as a Jew, fulfilling the law completely, the one and only person who ever fulfilled the law of Moses completely, so that the law could pass away and no longer was required for the people of God to follow. So this is, I think, a good point that she makes, and well worth understanding, especially as we begin into the book. And she does point out, and I think very the inner workings of the Sanhedrin, which was the council of the Jewish leaders, very interesting, like very interesting. Why they did this, what's the context of this? Why would they care about this? Like, this is stuff that we don't think about, and she goes through and talks about it, and it's so helpful, at least to me. So anyway, that's everything that I thought that we should touch base about today. I don't plan to read to you from the book in future meetings, because everybody will have the book by then, and we'll have a few topics that I think we should talk about, and then you will bring topics that you think should be talked about. So I see myself here as more of like a facilitator than as a lecturer. I don't want to do that. I want it to be a back and forth, an interesting conversation, and I'd be very happy if most of my time was spent just translating between the people who are online and the people who are sitting here, with the conversation having not very much to do with me. But I'll be ready if for some reason folks are not excited to talk about certain topics. But I think you will be, because I think that's a very interesting thing. So, and yeah, go ahead.
Just,
Lori has a question.
she says that the New Testament uses non-Jews they call Greeks, but then who are the Gentiles?
So Lori says that Presbyter Eugenia says that in the New Testament they call non-Jews Greeks. They also call them Gentiles. Yeah, same thing. It's like the Lake of Gennesaret, which is also the Sea of Tiberias, which is also, so sometimes there are different words used for the same thing, but essentially the way the Jews saw the world is there's the people of God, that was them, and there's everybody else, and those are the Gentiles, because the Romans took them over and they were speaking Greek at that time, so they called them Greeks. Christ spoke Greek also. He spoke Aramaic, but he spoke Greek also. That was the lingua franca of the time. So if you wanted to exist in any kind of way in the Greek Empire, or in the Roman Empire, you better know how to speak Greek.
So why Jews don't consider that he did actually fulfill all of the promise? Why are they stuck in not believing whatever?
So let's ask the question: why do the Jews not feel that Christ fulfilled? A subset of people decided not to follow Christ, and why others did. And so I don't want to kind of make a short synopsis of it here, but that is a big topic in the book, as well as some really cool things about the temple that I learned when I read it. Like, I'll pull back the curtain, quote unquote, a little bit, because I'm going to tell you something about the curtain that was between the Holy of Holies and the rest of the temple. It was as thick as your hand. So actually, strictly speaking, there's supposed to be two. They think at that time, they probably were using one. There had been a lot of changes that the Jewish leaders had made to the faith. This is one of the reasons that Christ came, was to try to call people back to living the life that they were called to live. And it wasn't just these external things like in the worship, but in any case, it was about that thick. So when we read that when Christ died on the cross, that the temple, that the curtain was ripped in two, it wasn't just like some thin piece of fabric that you could see through. It was something, incredibly heavy. It took, I think, 30 priests to change that curtain because it was so heavy. So anyway, that I think there's all kinds of really interesting stuff like that really provides a lot more context. So when you hear in the gospel that the curtain was ripped from the top to the bottom, you won't think anymore like, oh, maybe there was a little earthquake or something happened. And what happened in the temple after Christ died, that's so interesting. And I'm not going to tell you what it is, because if I tell you everything, it won't be so interesting for you. But like, that was so interesting for me. So, I mean, I've been a priest for 30 years. I have, more theological education than is probably safe for any one person. And I learned a lot by reading this book. And I think you will too. So I'm excited about it. And I hope you are as well. So it's about 8 o'clock. And I'd like us to kind of shoot for about an hour each time, a little more, a little less. I think that's probably the best. So unless there's other questions, I'm going to suggest that we say a prayer and say good night, and encourage everybody to get the book if they haven't done that yet, and catch up with the reading. The first chapter is not super long, so you're not going to be reading, like 100 pages this week. It's nothing like that. So if you haven't gotten the book, try to get it as soon as you can. Catch up so that by the time we meet next Wednesday, everyone will have read the first chapter, and we'll be able to talk about that in some depth, and try to bring a question. If you have questions, try to bring one. I think it's really useful if it's not just me who has questions. Believe me, I'll have plenty of things to say if you don't, but it's, I think, much more interesting when you bring it up, because a question up, because if you have it, that probably means everybody else has it too. Okay. All right. So let's pray, and then we will say good night. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless, and Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gavest birth to God the Word. The very Theotokos thee do we magnify. Thank you, everyone. And everyone who's online.
Thank you. Thank you, Father.